Get up and leave here now. You are an insult to everyone here.
The story begins in the heat of the moment. They threw my ring into the dirt and laughed as my knees hit the marble floor. My fiancée didn't say a word, she just turned away. I was the poor delivery boy who didn't know his place. Then the heavy black SUVs pulled up, and the look of triumph on their faces turned into pure, petrified terror. Before we continue, please like, subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. The engine of my beat-up scooter coughed, sputtered, and finally died just as I pulled up to the curb. It was a piece of junk, but it was mine, the only thing I own that hadn't been purchased with my father's blood money. I climbed off, adjusted my faded helmet, and checked my watch. 8 minutes until my shift ended at the logistics hub, and then, finally, I could see her. My name is Lee Minyi, but to the people at the hub, I'm just the guy who never complains about the heavy loads or the double shifts. To the world, I'm nobody. That's exactly how I like it. For the last 2 years, I've traded the opulence of my father's high-rise penthouse for a cramped studio apartment that smells perpetually of instant noodles and laundry detergent. My father, Lee Dong-hyuk, calls it a pathetic experiment. I call it finding out who I really am when the guards, the bulletproof vests, and the endless stream of sycophants are stripped away. The only thing that makes the grime and the exhaustion worth it is Park Hae-in. I caught a glimpse of her across the parking lot as I locked up my bike. She was standing by her car, looking like a dream in a simple white blouse, the soft evening light catching the gold chain she wore, the one I'd saved 3 months of delivery wages to buy her. When she saw me, her expression softened from impatient to something warmer, something that made the weight of the day just vanish. "You're late," she said, though there was no real bite in her voice. She stepped forward, brushing a smudge of road dust off my shoulder. "The traffic was a nightmare," I lied. The truth was my bike had overheated again, but she didn't need to know that. "I'm sorry, Hae-in." She smiled, and in that moment, I forgot about the empire waiting for me in the shadows, the enemies my father made before I was even born, and the cold, sterile luxury I had left behind. She didn't care that my hands were calloused or that I smelled like exhaust. She saw me, or at least, she saw the version of me I allowed her to see. I reached into my pocket, feeling the cold, hard weight of the ring box hidden behind my phone. For months, I had been terrified that she was just as caught up in social status as her mother, Choi Sun-hee. But every time we sat in my tiny kitchen, laughing over cheap takeout, I felt a little more certain. Tonight was the gala, her mother's world. It would be my final test. If she could stand by me in the lion's den, surrounded by the people who looked down on men like me, then I knew. I would tell her everything. I would finally let her into my real life. "Ready for tonight?" she asked, tucking her hair behind her ear. "I'm ready for anything," I said, and for once I meant it. The city lights flickered in the distance, a sprawling grid of neon and ambition that felt a world away from the quiet corner where we stood. Hae-in leaned against her car, oblivious to the fact that the man beside her, the man with grease under his fingernails, was the sole heir to the syndicate that effectively controlled the very ground she was standing on. She reached out, tracing the line of my jaw with a thumb that felt far too delicate for a life as rough as mine. "My mother is going to be difficult tonight," she whispered, her brow furrowing with a familiar, anxious tension. "She's been pushing me to meet that venture capitalist she's always talking about. She thinks I'm wasting my time." I didn't flinch. I had heard the venom in Choi Sun-hee's voice during our few brief, icy encounters. To her, I wasn't a partner for her daughter. I was an inconvenient obstacle in her grand design for social mobility. "Let her think what she wants," I said, my voice steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. I had made my decision. The charade had gone on long enough. I was tired of living in the shadows, tired of the constant, gnawing doubt that came with playing the part of a pauper. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn-out jacket and felt the velvet box. It was small, discreet, and contained a diamond that had likely cost more than the annual revenue of the logistics company I worked for. It was a symbol of my life, a life of immense, brutal power, but it was also a gamble. If she accepted it here, in the dirt, knowing I had nothing but my sweat and my love to offer, then she was everything I had hoped for. She would be my queen in a world that didn't play by the rules of society. But if she hesitated, If she chose the comfort of her mother's approval over the man standing in front of her, I would have my answer. "Hey-in," I started, my pulse quickening. She looked up, her dark eyes wide and curious. "What is it, Minyi?" "Tonight," I said, my hand closing tighter around the box in my pocket. "Tonight is going to change everything. No matter what happens at that gala, no matter what your mother says or how the world looks at us, I want you to know that I'm yours, completely." She laughed softly, a bright melodic sound that almost made me regret the path I was choosing. She didn't have a clue. She didn't know that by the end of the night, she would either be the partner of the most powerful man in the city, or she would be gone from my life forever. "You're being dramatic," she teased, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. "Just a promise," I replied, a small sad smile playing on my lips, a secret one. Hayen insisted on driving, so I left my scooter at the hub and settled into the passenger seat of her sedan. The silence between us was heavy with the unspoken weight of what was coming. I was crossing a line tonight, entering the territory of people who looked down on my lifestyle, people who viewed my existence as a stain on their pristine, high society reputation. When we pulled up to the park residence, the grandeur was sickeningly predictable. Crystal chandeliers glittered behind floor-to-ceiling windows, and the driveway was packed with enough high-end imports to finance a small nation. Choi Sun-hee was waiting by the front doors, looking like a statue carved from ice and entitlement. She was draped in a silk gown that must have cost more than my annual salary, her sharp eyes scanning the arrivals with predatory precision. When she spotted Hayen's car, her face hardened into a mask of polite disdain. "You're late," she said, ignoring me entirely as we approached the steps. Her gaze flicked toward my scuffed leather jacket and dark jeans, her lips curling in a subtle, cutting sneer. "I'm sorry, Mother," Hayen said, her voice dropping into the deferential tone she always used when she was intimidated. "The traffic was." "Traffic is an excuse for the disorganized," Sun-hee interrupted, her eyes finally landing on me. She looked me up and down with the clinical detachment of a butcher inspecting a piece of spoiled meat. "And I see you've brought your project." "His name is Minyi, Mother," Hayen insisted, though her hand trembled slightly in mine. Sun-hee let out a sharp, brittle laugh. "I know who he is, Hayen. I know exactly who he is. A delivery driver with lofty aspirations and zero prospects. You are an embarrassment to this family, boy." I stood perfectly still, my expression a carefully crafted display of humility. If she knew the extent of my father's reach, if she realized that with a single phone call I could dismantle the foundations of the company her husband had spent 40 years building, she would have been on her knees. But she didn't. She saw a boy in a cheap jacket, and that was exactly the leverage I needed. "I'm just here to support Hayen," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold fire burning in my chest. Sun-hee stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, searching for a crack in my composure. Finding none, she scoffed. "You may enter, but keep to the shadows, Minyi. This is a room of professionals, of people who have earned their place in this world. Don't humiliate my daughter by reminding everyone that she associates with the help." She turned on her heel and glided inside, leaving the door open. Hayen looked at me, pale and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Minyi, just please stay close to me." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. The stage was set. The ballroom was a sprawling, glittering landscape of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, casting a cold, brilliant light over 200 people draped in silk, diamonds, and enough arrogance to fill the room 10 times over. I adjusted the collar of my suit, a mass-produced, navy blue garment I'd picked up from a discount rack weeks ago. It was stiff, ill-fitting, and smelled faintly of a department store warehouse. Everywhere I looked, eyes followed us. I could practically feel the judgment radiating from the room like heat off a radiator. To these people, the sharp line of a bespoke suit was a prerequisite for existence, and my presence was a literal stain on the carpet. Hayen squeezed my hand, her knuckles turning white. "Just ignore them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of a string quartet playing in the corner. "They don't know you like I do." I kept my head down, playing the part of the nervous, out-of-place boyfriend. I had spent my entire life in rooms like this, only back then, I was the one everyone clamored to impress. I knew exactly how these people operated. They judged worth by the price of a watch or the prestige of a family name. They were shallow, opportunistic, and entirely predictable. As we navigated the room, I caught fragments of conversation. Who is that? Where did he come from? Doesn't the Park family have any standards? I felt a cold amusement tickling the back of my throat. If they only knew. A flick of my wrist, a single text to my father's head of operations, and the man laughing at my shoes across the room would find his family business liquidated before the dessert course was served. I was currently the most dangerous man in the room, yet here I was, acting the part of a timid delivery boy. "Minyi, are you okay?" Hayin asked, pulling me toward a quieter corner away from the prying stares. "I'm fine," I said, offering her a faint, practiced smile. I wasn't just okay, I was energized. This wasn't just a party, it was a theater of the absurd. I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of shame, any hint that she wished she had brought the venture capitalist her mother wanted instead of me. She looked worried, yes, but she didn't look ashamed. She held my hand firmly, anchoring me against the tide of disdain. It was enough to keep me from walking out, enough to keep me from exposing the truth right then and there. "I'm here for you," I whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always," she replied. I looked back at the crowd, my gaze hardening. The night had only just begun. I felt the air in the room shift before I even saw her. Sun-hee wasn't just walking, she was hunting. She moved through the crowd like a shark, her eyes locked on me with a terrifying, icy intensity. Beside her walked a man in an expensive, tailored suit, an associate from the firm, I assumed, who was busy scrolling through a tablet. They stopped 10 feet away. Sun-hee didn't bother with pleasantries. She held out a hand, and the associate handed her a stack of documents. "I have to admit, Minyi," she began, her voice cutting through the nearby music like a razor. "I'm impressed by the level of deception you've maintained. A delivery driver, living in a studio apartment, how very bohemian of you." Hayin stiffened beside me, her grip on my hand tightening until it hurt. "Mother, what are you doing?" Sun-hee ignored her daughter, her gaze fixed entirely on me. "I don't like being lied to, and I certainly don't like my daughter being used as a social experiment for a bottom feeder." She gestured to the documents in her hand. "My investigators found the rental agreement for your apartment. It's a sham. You aren't even on the lease. It's a commercial space. And your employment records, they're practically non-existent. You're a ghost, Minyi. Or perhaps just a con artist who forgot that in this city, everything has a paper trail." A hush began to ripple through the ballroom. People were stopping their conversations, drinks suspended halfway to their lips. The music seemed to fade into the background. "Mother, please," Hayin begged, stepping between us. "You're making a scene." "I am protecting you, Hayin," Sun-hee snapped, her voice rising to a sharp, commanding pitch. She turned back to me, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "You think you can waltz into my home, masquerade as a normal man, and groom my daughter for your benefit? You're not even a man of means. You're a parasite." She signaled to a security guard standing by the pillar. The man stepped forward, his massive frame looming over me. "I've already contacted the authorities regarding your falsified identity, Mr. Lee," she said, savoring every word. "But before they arrive, I think it's only appropriate that my guests see exactly what you are: a fraud, a failure, a boy who thinks he's a man." She looked around the room, signaling for the guests to gather closer. She wanted an audience. She wanted total, absolute destruction. I looked at Hayin, searching her eyes for a spark of defiance, but all I saw was fear. Fear of her mother, fear of the truth. "Kneel," Sun-hee commanded, her voice cold as the grave. "Kneel and admit you're nothing." The command hung in the air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and malice. The ballroom went deathly silent. Hundreds of eyes, the elite, the powerful, the cruel, bored into me. I felt the security guard's heavy hand press against my shoulder, a physical weight meant to force me down. I didn't resist. Instead, I let my knees hit the marble floor with a deliberate, echoing thud. Hayin let out a sharp, strangled sob. Mother, stop, this is insane. I ignored her. My hand moved to my jacket, not to reveal a weapon, but to pull out the small velvet box. The room gasped. Even Sunhee recoiled as if I'd pulled a grenade. I held it out toward Hayin, my face calm, my breathing steady despite the humiliation. I didn't come here to lie, Hayin, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension. I came here to ask you to share a life that is much bigger than what you see right now. Sunhee let out a harsh, jagged laugh. A ring? You think a piece of glass bought at a pawn shop earns you a seat at my table? You don't have a table, boy. You don't even have a chair. She didn't wait for me to open it. She stepped forward, her sharp heel clicking against the floor like a hammer on an anvil. With a swift, practiced motion, she kicked the box from my hand. It skidded across the polished marble, tumbling until it came to a stop at the feet of a tuxedo donor. The ring tumbled out, a brilliant, cold fire under the chandelier light. Pick it up, she hissed, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. She smelled of cold jasmine. Pick up your pathetic trinket and get out. You're trash, Minyi. You're a gutter rat trying to feast at a king's banquet. Look at her, look at your precious Hayin. She's not even looking at you, she's embarrassed. Even she knows you don't belong here. I glanced at Hayin. She stood with her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her expression frozen in a mixture of mortification and cowardice. She didn't meet my eyes. She stared at the floor, at the ring, at the spilled wine near her feet. Did you hear me? Sunhee shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I said, get out. You're an insult to everyone in this room. The crowd began to titter, then to laugh. It was a rhythmic, collective sound of disdain. A phone camera flashed in my face. I was being documented, recorded, and archived as a joke. I stayed on my knees, my jaw clenched, feeling the cold marble against my skin. The normal life I wanted, the simple love I had tried to build, was dissolving, leaving behind only the sharp, familiar taste of rage. I looked up, waiting for the one person who mattered to say something, anything, to stop this. Hayin stood in the center of the circle, her face illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving chandelier light. She looked smaller than she ever had, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed anywhere but on me. Hayin, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it felt like a shout in the absolute stillness of the ballroom. She flinched, but she didn't move. She didn't step toward me. She didn't challenge her mother's cruel, tearing words. Instead, she took a half step backward, her arms tightening across her chest, as if she were shielding herself from the radiation of my humiliation. I didn't know, she murmured, her voice hollow, devoid of the warmth that used to greet me at the logistics hub. I didn't know you were this, Minyi, you never said. Her betrayal cut deeper than Sunhee's sharpest insults ever could. Sunhee was just a shark doing what sharks do. But Hayin, she was the anchor, and in the moment the storm hit, she had cut the chain. She wasn't just silent, she was choosing. She was choosing the silk, the diamonds, and the cold approval of her mother over the man who had loved her through every shift, every struggle, and every doubt. The laughter in the room grew louder, fueled by her distance. I saw a group of men near the bar recording me on their phones, their faces twisted in mocking grins. I watched the woman I loved turn away, her back now a solid, impenetrable wall between us. In that heartbeat, something within me simply snapped. The last trace of the delivery driver died. The humbleness I had cultivated, the patience I had practiced, the naive hope that love could somehow bridge the chasm between their world and mine, it all evaporated. I stood up slowly, deliberate in every motion. The security guard reached for my arm, but I didn't let him touch me. I didn't need to fight. I just looked at him, and his hand dropped, as if the air around me had suddenly turned to ice. I didn't look at Hayin again. There was no point. The girl I had loved was a ghost, a fantasy I had projected onto someone who was never strong enough to stand beside me. I smoothed out my cheap suit, feeling the fabric against my skin as if it were a costume I was finally peeling off. The silence now wasn't one of anticipation, it was one of dread. I reached into my pocket, not for a ring, but for my phone. The screen glowed in the dim light, the only beacon of reality in a room of illusions. I tapped a single icon. It's time, I said to the empty air. Outside, the distant, rhythmic thrum of heavy engines began to vibrate the floorboards beneath our feet. The vibration grew from a tremor to a deafening roar. Outside, the screech of sirens didn't herald the police. It was the synchronized wail of an approaching motorcade. The ballroom's glass doors shuddered, the panes vibrating in their frames as if the building itself were bowing. Inside, the laughter died. Sun Hee's smug smile faltered, her gaze darting toward the entrance. Heian looked up, her face pale, her hands trembling as the sheer scale of the intrusion hit the room. "What is that?" someone stammered. "Who would dare?" The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed against the marble, a sound of disciplined, overwhelming force. Then, the double doors burst inward, ripped from their hinges by the sheer momentum of the intrusion. 30 men in charcoal suits and dark tactical gear flooded the room, moving with the cold, lethal precision of a shadow army. They didn't shout, they didn't push. They simply moved, creating a human gauntlet that parted the panicked guests like a blade through silk. Every guest in the room fell into a terrified silence, the bravado of the elite evaporating in seconds. And then he walked in. Lee Donghyuk, the man who owned the city's veins, stepped onto the marble floor. He didn't look like a mobster, he looked like a king. His silver hair was combed back, his suit cut from midnight wool, and his eyes, the same eyes that stared back at me in the mirror, were devoid of everything but absolute, suffocating authority. He didn't look at the decor or the guests or the wine. He looked only at me. He stopped, his heavy footsteps finally silenced. He stood 10 feet away from Sun Hee, who looked as if she were witnessing an execution. "Men Ye," my father said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He looked at my bruised lip, the ring box lying abandoned in the dust, and the way the guests had circled me like vultures. A single, imperceptible nod to his men was all it took. Within heartbeats, the ballroom was fully occupied. Every exit was blocked. The guards who had tried to manhandle me earlier were now on their knees, their own faces pressed into the cold floor by my father's men. Sun Hee's knees buckled. She looked at the man who commanded an army, then at the delivery driver standing beside him. The color drained from her face, leaving her a ghastly, trembling shade of gray. "You," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of wind. "You're the son of—" I didn't answer. I just straightened my tie, the cheap fabric suddenly feeling like armor. "I believe I was asked to leave," I said, my voice echoing through the silent, paralyzed room, "but I think I've decided to stay." I walked toward Sun Hee, each step heavy and rhythmic, the sound of my dress shoes against the marble sounding like gunfire in the suffocating silence. She retreated until she hit a pillar, her elegant composure shattered into jagged shards of pure, unadulterated terror. Behind her, Heian stood frozen, her eyes wide, flickering between the man she had mocked and the man she had betrayed. "You wanted to see what I was, Sun Hee," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of the warmth that had once been reserved for her daughter. "You wanted to see if I belonged in your world. The truth is, your world is nothing more than a sandbox, and you've been playing with fire you couldn't possibly understand." I signaled my father. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply pulled a slim, black burner phone from his pocket and tapped it once. "Mr. Park," my father said, addressing the patriarch who had been hiding in the back, trembling. "Your offshore holdings in the shipping sector have been seized. Your primary real estate equity under our control as of 30 seconds ago. By sunrise, your firm will be insolvent. By noon, the banks will be at your door." The room erupted in gasps, but they were cut short by the cold, heavy stares of my father's men. "But you can't," Sun Hee stammered, her voice cracking. "We have contracts, we have status." "You had a future," I corrected, stopping right in front of her. I reached down, picked up the ring box from the marble and snapped it shut. The sound was like a final verdict. "You had a daughter who could have been part of something real, something that actually mattered, but you traded it for social posturing. You traded loyalty for a price tag, and now you're bankrupt." Heian finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, broken plea. "Minyi, please, I didn't know, tell them to stop. We can talk about this." I turned to her, The pity I felt was sharper than any anger. You had your chance to talk, Hayin. You had your chance to stand beside me when I was nothing. You chose the silence of your mother's world. Now, enjoy the consequences of that silence. I walked toward the exit, my father matching my stride. We didn't look back at the ruin we were leaving behind. The ballroom, once a temple of elite pride, was now a tomb for the Park family's legacy. As we stepped out into the cool night air, the black SUVs pulled forward in a perfect, silent line. My father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Lessons in power," he said, his tone clinical. "It's a cruel curriculum, Minyi." "I learned everything I needed to know," I replied. I was no longer the delivery boy. I was the heir to the empire, and for the first time, I finally felt at home. Thank you for staying till the end. Your support helps us to bring more interesting stories to life.